That the Germans have so much as endured their philosophers, above all that most deformed conceptual cripple there has ever been, the great Kant, offers a good idea of German amenableness. In case you missed it, this quote should be read with a great deal of sarcasm. The amenableness of the German, of which Nietzsche is speaking here, is not a compliment. And neither is the word great prefixed to the name of Kant. In fact, Nietzsche's works are littered with shots at Kant. Sometimes they are serious critiques, but other times they're just ordinary insults. But as this video will hopefully make clear, even when Nietzsche is simply being insulting, his insults carry with them the assumption that the reader knows where Nietzsche's ire comes from. We've done other videos in this vein on why Nietzsche hated Plato and Socrates. You could check them out by clicking the link in the description. And we are planning to release more videos like this in the future, so please subscribe if you don't want to miss them. The quote at the start of the video comes from Twilight of the Idols, one of Nietzsche's later works. It's decidedly more radical in tone than his earlier work. For a more nuanced take on Immanuel Kant, we need to go visit Nietzsche's earlier writings. Let's take a look at Nietzsche's most sustained critique of him, the one we find in Beyond Good and Evil. It concerns one of Kant's central ideas in metaphysics, his table of categories. By the way, this video doesn't presuppose an in-depth knowledge of Kant's philosophy. We'll try to fill you in as we go. But if you want to brush up on some fundamental philosophical knowledge, you can check out Brilliant, the sponsor of this video. Brilliant is an interactive learning platform that offers hands-on lessons in math, science, and computer science. They have an interactive teaching method that focuses on solving problems instead of just memorizing stuff. What's particularly interesting is they have 2 courses on logic. Of course, logic is the backbone of philosophy, and Kant in particular has an analytical style which is more easily understood if you have a firm grasp of logic. Every philosopher worth his salt has at least some training in logic, but it can be an intimidating subject to learn. Brilliant takes you step by step through the entire learning process in a fun, interactive way. Join the millions of people already learning on Brilliant with a special offer just for viewers of the channel. Head to brilliant.org/Weltgeist to get started for free with Brilliant's interactive lessons. The first 200 viewers will also get 20% off an annual membership. Thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now back to Kant's table of categories. Kant's famous table of categories is a list of things, for lack of a better word, which serve as the conditions of existence for objects. Kant set out to create a list of categories which are necessary for the possibility of knowing objects. Remember that according to Kant's transcendental idealism, we as human subjects only ever perceive the world through this lens of our subjectivity. Kant's great contribution to philosophy was to revolutionize the way people thought about the relationship between the object and the subject. Kant posited that the world as we ordinarily perceive it does not arise out of any objective viewpoint. Our experience and knowledge of the world is always mediated by the senses and our cognition. Consider the world. We tend to think that what we see is what we get, in the sense that we believe that the world as we perceive it is the world as it really is. When you see a tree, you assume that the tree is actually there in an objective sense. You don't believe you're dreaming or hallucinating. In other words, you believe in a real objective reality, and you believe your senses give you reliable information on the nature of that reality. The accomplishment of Kant exists in showing that this is not the case. Your knowledge of the tree is mediated, not immediate. What this means is that the image of the tree, as you perceive it, is not pure. It has passed through the filter of your mind, so to speak. Kant's accomplishment was to show that there is no black and white distinction between subject, you, the perceiving agent, and object, the tree you're seeing. The subject is an active agent, not just a passive observer. What does this mean? It means that your perception of the world is shaped by your mind. To shape our perception of the world, the mind has a few tools at its disposal. Every object that we experience must be shaped according to these tools and fit into these categories. As such, the categories are a priori, universal, and necessary. They are principles of human understanding, not features of a mind-independent reality. This is an important distinction. The categories are a feature of the mind, of the subject, not of the object or of the external world or the thing in itself. Keep in mind that for Kant, nothing can be known about the thing in itself except that it exists. The table of categories appears on the screen right now. Don't worry too much about the precise contents, because Nietzsche's critique will not focus on the content of the table, but on the table itself. For the sake of completeness, let's take a look at how this table works. We have 12 categories divided in 4 classes with 3 sub-answers each. For every possible object of cognition, we can ask ourselves, what is its quantity, quality, relation, and modality? And for each of these questions, we have 3 answers to choose from. The table of categories is therefore a part of Kant's answer to the question, how does the mind work? How does it make sense of the world? How does it generate experience? It's in large part his answer to the famous question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? With his table of categories, Kant believed that he had discovered a new faculty of human reason, and that with this discovery he answered these profound questions. In the words of Nietzsche, Kant was first and foremost proud of his table of categories. With it in his hand, he said, "This is the most difficult thing that could ever be undertaken on behalf of metaphysics. Let us only understand this could be." He was proud of having discovered a new faculty in man. Nietzsche's critique boils down to this. He accuses Kant of not saying much at all. Nietzsche paints with a very broad brush here, as he is wont to do. But his argument is really that behind all the technical terms and expensive words, Kant is moving around in a circle and is in fact not accomplishing much at all. He's going nowhere. How does the mind work? Asks Kant. And what is his answer? By a faculty of the mind. The mind works by virtue of a principle by which the mind works. Nietzsche says this is a non-answer. In Nietzsche's words, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Kant asks himself. And what is really his answer? By means of a means, a faculty. But unfortunately, not in 5 words, but so circumstantially, imposingly, and with such display of German profundity and verbal flourishes that one altogether loses sight of the comical niaiserie allemande involved in such an answer. By means of a means, a faculty, he had said, or at least meant to say. But is that an answer? An explanation? Or is it not rather merely a repetition of the question? To drive the point home, Nietzsche quotes a famous passage in Molière's comedic play La Malade Imaginaire, in which a physician explains how opium puts someone to sleep by appealing to a dormitive principle in opium whose nature it is to put things to sleep. In other words, the physician is not really explaining anything at all. He just repeats the question and pretends to have given a profound answer. How does opium put someone to sleep? By means of a means. But such replies belong to the realm of comedy, and it is high time to replace the Kantian question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, by another question, why is belief in such judgments necessary? The first part of Nietzsche's critique centers around the circle in which he claimed Kant moved, saying that Kant didn't really answer the question at all, but merely repeated it, like the doctor in Molière's play. The second part of his critique is not unique to Kant, but rather a general point Nietzsche makes about all philosophy in Beyond Good and Evil, namely that each philosophy is only the reflection of the personality of the philosopher who came up with it. Kant asks the question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? And Nietzsche replies with another question, why should they be possible? Kant had a very clear goal with his philosophy. He had already decided his destination. He wanted to build a bridge between the rationalism of Descartes and the empiricism of Hume, and in the process of doing so, save the possibility of scientific knowledge, a priori synthetic judgments. Kant therefore stands accused of putting the cart before the horse. Rather than being a disinterested, cold, objective thinker who will follow whatever path philosophy takes him, Nietzsche accuses him of having already set a destination and then rationalizing his way towards a path to that destination. Kant wanted to save the possibility of synthetic judgments a priori, and therefore he found a way to do so. But this is the wrong way to go about things, as we are supposed to believe, and indeed we delude ourselves into believing that philosophy is an autonomous activity that will lead wherever it leads. If we have a predetermined conclusion we want to arrive at, that's suspicious. Philosophy is supposed to be the discipline that will tell us, through investigation and deep thought, which conclusions are correct. If we presuppose a certain conclusion, we are skipping the entire philosophical process. Nietzsche accuses basically every philosopher of doing this, including Kant. Most notably, in Beyond Good and Evil, he also attacks Descartes for doing the same thing. We go deeper into that particular critique in our dedicated video analysis of Beyond Good and Evil, and there's a link in the description if you're interested. But to go back to Kant's major question. In effect, it is high time that we should understand that such judgments must be believed to be true for the sake of the preservation of creatures like ourselves. Synthetic judgments a priori should not be possible at all. We have no right to them. In our mouths they are nothing but false judgments. Only, of course, the belief in their truth is necessary. So far we have only discussed Kant's metaphysics and epistemology, but Nietzsche's most vitriolic critiques are reserved for Kant's system of morals. The foundation of his critique is the same. Philosophers come up with systems that are not the result of a dispassionate objective search for truth, but rather every philosophical system is a way for the philosopher to justify his personality, emotions, or prejudiced beliefs. For Nietzsche, this is true in the realm of metaphysics, like we just discussed, as well as in the domain of ethics. Kant's ethical system became famous because of the so-called categorical imperative. This is a principle based on duty for which Kant developed three formulations. The most well-known one is the following: act only in accordance to that maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it should become universal law. The basis of Kantian ethics is this principle. It's based on duty, not on compassion or love for God or whatever. It holds that the right course of action in any given circumstance is that course of action of which you can will that it becomes a universal law. According to the categorical imperative, murder is wrong not because of an innate sense of compassion in humans, nor because God forbids it, nor because the prospect of jail is a deterrent. But murder is wrong simply because it is our duty to behave in such a way as to only engage in actions that we should want to become universalized. Murder is therefore wrong, because if everyone started murdering each other, life would cease to exist and there would be no one left to be moral in the first place. Nietzsche absolutely hated this idea that morality is based on duty. The first question to ask is, duty to whom? It's not a duty to your parents, not a duty to your village priest, not a duty to your country, it's not even a duty to God. It's duty to an idea, to a concept. This is completely alien to Nietzsche, a decidedly inhuman way to look at morality. By the way, Schopenhauer also considered this one of Kant's greatest mistakes, even though he counted himself as a successor to Kant and imported basically his whole system of metaphysics into his own philosophy. Schopenhauer's problem with Kant is not so much metaphysical but ethical. Schopenhauer too believed it was preposterous to claim that morality arises out of duty. For Schopenhauer, the source of morality is compassion. It comes from the innate sense of empathy humans share with each other and indeed with animals as well. If you are interested in this, you can check out our big video on Schopenhauer's main work. Link in the description. Back to Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, the question we should ask ourselves is not, is Kant's theory of ethics true? Rather, we should ask, what does it say about Kant that he came up with his system in the first place? Apart from the value of such assertions as there is a categorical imperative in us, one can always ask, what does such an assertion indicate about him who makes it? Kant especially gives us to understand by his morals that what is esteemable in me is that I know how to obey, and with you it shall not be otherwise than with me. In short, systems of morals are only a sign language of the emotions. However, like we said, this critique of Nietzsche is not unique to Kant. He accuses every philosopher of doing this, even himself when you read between the lines of Ecce Homo, his autobiography. In Daybreak, a book published before Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers us a bit of a smoking gun by quoting Kant himself. In his magnum opus, The Critique of Pure Reason, Kant speaks of majestic moral edifices. Specifically, he says, we must confine ourselves for the present to the task of preparing a firm foundation for those majestic edifices of moral science. The phrase majestic moral edifices has become a well-known Kantian formulation, and Nietzsche saw in this sentence a black-on-white proof of his critique. Kant was not just exploring uncharted territory and going wherever his investigation takes him. Rather, he set out to find a way to justify these majestic moral edifices which had been erected by the moral science before him. In other words, from the outset, he sought to justify a set of moral precepts. But this runs completely counter to the idea of engaging in a fundamental philosophical investigation. The destination was already set in stone, while it should have been an unknown. This investigation is supposed to reveal the destination, not reach a predetermined one. All philosophers, including Kant himself, were building under the seductive influence of morality. They aimed at certainty and truth only in appearance, but in reality their attention was directed towards majestic moral edifices, to use once more Kant's innocent mode of expression. This is not the end of Nietzsche's critique of Kant, but it is the most explicit and sustained critique we can find of him. So before we go on, let's quickly reiterate the main points. First, Nietzsche argued that Kant's epistemology or metaphysics don't actually answer the question Kant set out to solve. How does the mind work? By means of a means, namely the table of categories. Nietzsche's main argument is that Kant moves in a circle. He merely repeats the question instead of answering it, like the doctor in the Molière play who explains how opium works by appealing to a normative principle. In other words, by not explaining how it works at all, just rephrasing the question in other words. A second critique concerns Kant's moral system, the categorical imperative. Nietzsche accuses Kant of having moral prejudices, predetermined ideas about what good behavior is, and then using his philosophy to arrive at these predetermined conclusions. In other words, he accuses Kant of not engaging in philosophy at all. But Kant is not alone in this, and it's a common method of attack for Nietzsche against basically every philosopher. These two critiques represent the most explicit attacks on the Kantian philosophy in Nietzsche, but they are far from the only attacks. Nietzsche scatters jabs at Kant throughout all of his major works, and it requires some rudimentary knowledge of Kant as well as of Nietzsche's perspective to be fully able to read between the lines and see where these jabs come from and what they mean exactly. These scattered attacks are much harder to explain properly because they don't critique a distinctive part of Kant's philosophical system, but rather the Kantian viewpoint as a whole. When we zoom out a bit, we can see a clear theme emerge in Nietzsche's problem with Kant, and it boils down to this. Nietzsche sees Kantian ethics simply as an extension and natural evolution of Christian morality. In order to fully grasp what this means, we need to understand two things. First, we need to understand Nietzsche's arguments for this claim. How and why is the Kantian system an extension of Christianity? And two, which is the underlying problem, why does Nietzsche reject Christian morality? If there's one book we can turn to in order to understand Nietzsche's problem with Christianity, the obvious choice would be The Antichrist. We are not going to reiterate Nietzsche's manifold attacks on Christianity in this video, but we've done an in-depth analysis of The Antichrist right here on the channel. If you're interested, there is a link in the description. Thankfully, The Antichrist also offers the most sustained general critique of Kant. In other words, in The Antichrist, we find the clearest expression of the answer to the question we posed earlier. How and why is the Kantian system an extension of Christianity? Let's take a look. What underpins Nietzsche's critique of Kant in his later works is the idea that Kant, in a very un-Christian way, arrived at very Christian conclusions. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant posited that true metaphysical knowledge, that is to say, knowledge of the world as it is, knowledge of the things in themselves, is impossible. Our knowledge, or rather our reason, is limited. As humans, we are doomed to view the world through our human lens, and it cannot be otherwise. Therefore, true objectivity, knowledge of the world as it is without this interference of our cognition, is impossible. The thing in itself, the Ding an sich, is a world that is forever hidden to us. We know that it's there, but as to its contents, what it's like, we must necessarily be silent. Kant's philosophy therefore arrives at a sort of dualism. There is the world of the here and now as we perceive it, but there is also another kind of world, the world in itself, that underpins this real world of ours. And this beyond world is the true object of metaphysical inquiry. Sadly, Kant came to the conclusion that definitive knowledge about this beyond world is impossible. Our reason cannot comprehend it. So this is where we are now. There is a world of appearance, but beyond that there is also the world in itself. This mysterious realm is the true object of our interest, but it's forever hidden from us because it's beyond the limit of our reason. For Nietzsche, this is simply rebranded Christianity. With Kant, a backstairs leading to the old ideal stood open. Reason, the prerogative of reason, does not go so far. Out of reality there had been made appearance. An absolutely false world, that of being, had been turned into reality. The success of Kant is merely a theological success. Nietzsche's central claim is that Kantian philosophy is simply Christian theology dressed up in philosophical language. Christian distrust of the material world in favor of a beyond world, heaven or the kingdom of God, is mirrored in Kant's system, where the world of appearance also has to take second place, beyond the world in itself. The great irony, according to Nietzsche, is that Kant, the so-called great Enlightenment philosopher, the man who coined the phrase sapere aude, dare to think, sought to liberate Europe from the shackles of dogma, and he simply arrived back at a Christian conclusion through unchristian means. What has actually been accomplished? Rather than freeing us from Christian dogmatic and scholastic thinking, the German theologians and priests were all too happy to engage with Kant. Why all the rejoicing over the appearance of Kant that went through the learned world of Germany, 3/4 of which is made up of the sons of preachers and teachers? Why the German conviction still echoing that with Kant came a change for the better? The theological instinct of German scholars made them see clearly just what had become possible again. What has become possible again is a philosophical system that in a roundabout way justifies the Christian worldview, not only in a metaphysical manner, but also in morals. Nietzsche dedicates an entire paragraph in the Antichrist to Kantian morals. Chiefly, he attacks Kant's idea that joy or pleasure should have no part in morality at all. Kant believed that morality consisted in obedience to the categorical imperative. Act only in accordance to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. But merely obeying this precept is not enough. Kant argued that an act cannot be morally good if you do it for any other reason than pure obedience. For example, if you selfishly stand to gain from obedience to the imperative, then it cannot count as morally good, because even if you adhere to the categorical imperative, your intention wasn't pure. Kant's ethics are therefore based upon an obedience to an impersonal, universal idea, the categorical imperative. This impersonal character is the first front of attack for Nietzsche, who considered blind obedience or duty to an impersonal idea as dangerous to life. A virtue must be our invention. It must spring out of our personal needs and defense. In every other case, it is a source of danger. That which does not belong to our life menaces it. A virtue which has its roots in mere respect for the concept of virtue, as Kant would have it, is pernicious. Virtue, duty, good for its own sake, goodness grounded upon impersonality or a notion of universal validity. These are all chimeras, and in them one finds only an expression of the decay, the last collapse of life. To think that no one has thought of Kant's categorical imperative as dangerous to life. Kant even goes a step further by claiming that if you follow the categorical imperative and you feel joy or pleasure while doing it, your motives aren't pure enough. The reasoning goes that it's easy to behave in a morally good way if you feel pleasure doing it. Not only are you being at least in part selfish by feeding your ego, it's simply no big deal to do things that give you pleasure, so why should you deserve credit? But for Nietzsche, this is not only unacceptable, it contradicts everything Nietzsche believes in. Joy is incredibly important in Nietzsche's philosophy. In fact, he named one of his books The Joyful Science. Joy is Nietzsche's antidote to the pervasive pessimism he finds in German philosophy, most notably in Kant and Schopenhauer. But it's also closely connected to power, and certainly by the time he wrote The Antichrist, the will to power had taken center stage in his philosophical worldview. An action prompted by the life instinct proves that it is a right action by the amount of joy that goes with it. And yet, that nihilist, with his bowels of Christian dogmatism, regarded pleasure as an objection. What destroys a man more quickly than to work, think, and feel without inner necessity, without any deep personal desire, without pleasure, as a mere automaton of duty? That is the recipe for decadence, and no less for idiocy. Kant became an idiot. Nietzsche attacked Kant on many fronts. He attacked his metaphysics in Beyond Good and Evil, where he argued that Kant didn't solve the one problem he set out to solve with his critique of pure reason, but merely repeated the question in different terms. Another front is Kant's moral philosophy. The categorical imperative, one of Kant's major accomplishments, is viewed by Nietzsche as dangerous to life. It reduces humans to mere automatons of duty, encouraging blind obedience to an abstract idea and removing joy, pleasure, and power from the domain of ethics completely, something which Nietzsche vehemently opposed. Above all, Nietzsche believed that Kant started with a conclusion in his ethical investigations, which is of course unacceptable in philosophy. Kant claimed to have begun a foundational investigation in the nature of ethics. Yet he also admits he sought to save the majestic moral edifices which Western tradition had built up over its history. And this final point leads into Nietzsche's general critique of Kant, that Kant was a Christian in disguise, that he has theologian's blood, that, in a roundabout way, he justified the Christian worldview by stripping it of its theological language and dressing it up in philosophical language. In the domain of metaphysics, this Christianization happened because Kant introduced the thing in itself, a kind of beyond world or hinterwelt which lay beyond our material world of the here and now. Just like Christianity's kingdom of God or heaven, this beyond world is incomprehensible to us, yet it forms the focal point of the worldview and it reduces this world to merely appearance, as in Kant's system, or this world is viewed as a preparation for the afterlife, as in Christianity. In this way, both Kant and Christianity make this world less real and they favor another faraway world. In the moral domain too, Kant was a Christian in disguise. His categorical imperative is all about obedience to a higher power, and its formulation is basically the same as Christ's golden rule of do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. However, instead of appealing to the authority of God or the word of Jesus, Kant appealed to our innate human reason, and, ironically enough, ultimately had to involve God in his ethics as well, but that's a topic for another video. In short, for Nietzsche, Kant was nothing more than another link in the long chain of Christian morality, which he saw as beginning with Plato all the way through Kant and Schopenhauer up until himself. Even if these philosophers progressively believe in God less and less, Nietzsche accuses them of clinging to God's morality all the same. Kant's ethical system results in an ethics that is more or less what you'd expect from a Christian morality, and Schopenhauer too had great admiration for Christian ethics. And while there are still some explicit traces of God left in Kant's philosophy, in Schopenhauer's system there is no need for a God at all. How convenient, and how coincidental then, says Nietzsche, that these godless systems ultimately affirm God's morality. You'd think that with the disappearance of God, or should we say the death of God, a new morality might arise. Yet to the contrary, it seems that the less we believe in God, the more we cling to his morality and worldview. That was Nietzsche's main problem with Kant. He still lives in God's shadow. After Buddha was dead, people showed his shadow for centuries afterwards in a cave. An immense, frightful shadow. God is dead, but as the human race is constituted, there will perhaps be caves for millenniums yet, in which people will show his shadow. And we have still to overcome his shadow. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There is more content on Nietzsche coming up, and comments for the algorithm are also greatly appreciated. We also want to thank our Patreons who support the channel and make these longer videos possible. If you like what we do and you want to support the channel, then please join us on Patreon. In the higher tiers you get access to Patreon exclusive videos we make for members only, with a new video every month added to this growing library. And if you want more Nietzsche, we've done a video on why Nietzsche hated Plato, as well as why Nietzsche hated Socrates. Again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.